I've been in prison. They don't dance in prison. Nobody dances unless, perhaps, in a cell alone, snapping fingers and wearing earphones, of course in dreams. And there are good sounds in the prison I was in because it is close to Canada, Montreal, and they like fine, and many of their programs are dedicated to young jazz musicians, and it is not always commercial, and some of these cats come on. And then there is some crazy stuff, too, right here that occasionally reaches there. Also, in the yard, groups with horns, guitars, and anything to drum, let go and clap hands and beat, and I've heard it. It's great. In fact, there was one way out man on a sax who blew all the time alone or with others. In the cell alone, and sometimes with a guy 2 cells away who would pick on a guitar and listen to jazz, and these guys would really go till 7 o'clock when the bell would ring for no more talking. They sometimes talk about dancing, remembering past experiences with social chicks who could dance their asses off, man. Anyway, I danced last night, and it made me very happy. I am not a clever dancer, that is. I don't ever know what I'm doing, particularly with my feet, but I always sort of let go, and wow, I get some great kicks. I did last night. This was from Huncke's journal. The story's called Dancing in Prison. Hello, welcome back to the library, and before we get lost amongst the stacks, I want to introduce my guest, Mr. Vernacular Spectacular himself, Davis Peck.
How's it going?
Welcome, Davis. We just got off doing this marathon about 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Had a little break. Do you have any thoughts before we get into the second part? I mean, any reactions about the first?
They made him older, younger back then.
They really did, didn't they? So before we get to beat, I want to acknowledge the two sources, American Hipster, the Times Square hustler who inspired the beat movement by Hillary Holiday, and then a Herbert Huncke reader edited by Benjamin G. Schaefer, not Sheriff. Oof. Okay.
How far were these biographies written from what's the distance between his actual life and...
Yeah, it's a good question. So the Herbert Huncke reader isn't a biography, right? It's his works collected.
That's probably an anthology.
Yeah, a couple years after he passed. And then the actual biography was written about 20 years later or 30 years later in the 2010, so 20-ish years.
In living memory-ish.
Yes, definitely. When we last left our little Herbie, he had just arrived to Manhattan in 1939 at the tender age of 24. He had already lived an adult's life. Let's leave it as that. He was let out at 103rd Street and Broadway and immediately asked for directions for 42nd Street. Quote, I was always quick in picking up scenes, and I took to 42nd Street. I was natural for it. Unquote. I wanted to touch upon the culture and the atmosphere near Times Square specifically, but also this general area of Manhattan throughout the time period we will be talking about. It is not the sweeping tourist attraction with high rents and unbelievable crowds of tourists we know today. High rents, to put it mildly. Times Square was, for lack of a better way of describing it, a place where some of the sleaziest parts of American culture congregated, with go-go bars, peep shows, prostitution open, and drugs that ran rampant. And this is true basically from the Great Depression all the way to way more recent than you can expect.
Yeah, like the 80s, right?
Yeah, it only began to change during the 80s when the New York City Planning Commission began enacting policies that would allow for the large, bright signs in the entertainment studios and the revitalization of the theaters in this area, to simplify it. The state of New York also took possession of the majority of historic theaters on 42nd Street, and the new 42nd Street nonprofit organization was set to oversee their maintenance. Further, and this hurts to say because I personally consider these companies and the person that we're going to talk about deeply unethical, to say the best, but 42nd Street also went through what is called, well, they got Disney-fied in the 1990s when Walt Disney Company bought and restored the New Amsterdam Theater and under their contract began to evict pornographic theaters nearby. Rudy Giuliani also made revitalization or the revitalizing of Times Square a key part of his mayorship. Since then, companies like the BlackRock Group and Boston Properties have won the rights to acquire sites to the properties. But just because the sex work was kicked out of this part of Manhattan doesn't mean it went away. It was simply pushed to other parts of Manhattan, the Bronx, and Queens. Times Square is now the most visited place by tourists in the whole world. Well, as of at least recording this podcast.
As of 3 months ago.
I know.
That is absurd. Like, what... I've only been to New York a couple times, but like the amount of cachet that Times Square has is so grossly overvalued.
Yeah, it's unbelievably expensive. So personally, my dad used to work near Times Square, but like off a little bit because where you got off was off the bus over there. You would basically be in Times Square. That's one of the reasons why Times Square is so great, is because the Port Authority is there and Grand Central Station's not far from it
Penn
as well.
Station's not too far.
Yeah, excuse me, Penn Station. Yeah, so it is all within walking distance, and like, yeah, it really is the heart of Manhattan if you can look at it on a map too. Yeah, and my dad used to work at a journalist over there, so we would be there all the time. And I remember when I was a kid, my dad would never let me like walk down to his place alone, but by the time I was a teenager, it was so safe, like it didn't matter.
Yeah, it wasn't. No one thought twice.
Yeah. Also, I mean, there were still homeless people pooping in the middle of the road, but that's New York City for you. So 42nd Street is a completely different world in Huncke's day. He would survive early on by hanging out in cafeterias or automats, the latter which is not really something we have in the U.S. anymore, but something I think is actually more common in places like Japan and South Korea. These are places with coin-operated vending machines where you could place a nickel or a dime and have about hundreds, if not thousands, of different kinds of fast foods basically giving to you at any time. He would also bum from one hotel to another, finding apartments here and there. Story of his life, really. Mostly he would be on the streets hustling, and I don't mean like the 2000 Rick Ross kind of hustling, where every day he'd be hustling, every day he'd be hustling, every day he'd be hustling like a prison guard in South Florida knows anything about hustling. I'm talking about selling your body for things like a few bucks, a couple of cheap drinks, hot meals, and drugs. I'm talking about the real, like, Noriega kind of hustling. Yeah. No, Herbert Huncke was on the streets whipping it real hard.
Wasn't Rick Ross talking about the Noriega kind of hustling too, though?
Yeah, that's the joke there. Yeah, he kept saying hustling the Noriega, which he wasn't. He was a prison guard in South Florida. Yeah. Herbert Huncke was on the streets whipping it real hard. Whip it real hard. Quote, Herbert Huncke here. Quote, I had led something of an open life in Chicago, but it was comparatively protected. I had never really been out scuffling on my own. No matter how bad things were in Chicago, if I couldn't get it from my father, I could bum it from my mother. But in New York, I didn't know anybody. I was strictly on my own for the first time, unquote. Now, I want to quote his biographer, Hillary Holiday, about his early time in Manhattan. Quote, the Great Depression had eased by 1939, and he could have found work as a clerk or a laborer, but Huncke took the low road instead, meeting up with closeted businessmen at Bickford's, which was the cafe that he frequented, or in Bryant Park behind the New York Public Library, unquote. Totally different world.
Yep.
Now, this lifestyle of drugs and hustling also eventually came with a large portion of petty robbery. It didn't take long for Herbert to get arrested for the first time as an adult. You see, he was partying in a dive bar that was nicknamed the Bucket of Blood.
Hell of a name.
I know. And he and a friend, the legendary jazz saxophonist Dexter Gordon, who, I mean, he was legend back there. He absolutely slaps. I just listened to him when I was writing this, actually. Decided to break a window of a car. They stole a portable radio and some socks, which began a drunken robbery spree.
How far down the road they get?
By the time they broke into the second car, however, the doorman outside the hotel witnessed it and called the cops. They were arrested. They each earned a 6-month sentence. And unlike Rick Ross, Herbert Huncke just got him some street cred. This was the first arrest as an adult. There would be very many more.
Oh, I'm sure.
He went to Hart's Island. Like any rational person in prison, he feared that he would be raped, especially if it got out that he was a gay hustler. It only took a few days before the person sleeping in the cot next to him tried to rape him. Quote, I picked up my shoe and clobbered him across the top of his head. I cut the whole side of his head, and he started to bleed. He said, you motherfucker, I'll get you for this. I put the shoe down. I didn't give a fuck what happened. If there was going to be any ratting, it was on him. Unquote. He was right. Another prisoner that was established told him later, quote, Huncke, don't you ever worry. No one's going to bother you. You declared yourself that night. Unquote.
So things don't change.
I mean, tropes are tropes for a reason. At least this is what he said, and I actually, again, have no reason to doubt this. I also don't think Herbert is too much of a fabulist ever because there's really no clear incentive for him to have made up the stories that we're going to talk about, frankly, period. I am willing to give him the benefit of doubt because, again, I think he was just an honest individual, even if he was, well, at least portrayed to be honest, even if he was a criminal.
Yeah. So the poem you read was observational. Is most of his work observational? Like, is it because he doesn't seem like he's creating a world so much as he's describing the world he exists in.
That is a great point. He barely never writes poems. They're all little short stories and snippets of his life. They're all observational. Nothing about his work isn't anything other than like what's within him. There are very few third-person narratives, and even that is based off his life. Which honestly, if you read the beats, very similar to everything what they do, except for maybe William S. Burroughs. But even then, Burroughs is also an asshole, which we'll find later. He got released and immediately went back to Times Square. He reconnects with a friend of his called Ed Leary. Quoting from a story Herbert wrote called Ed Leary, quote, I hadn't been in New York for long when I met Eddie. When I first arrived, I was stone broke, and like every young kid who hits New York, I went directly to 42nd Street. I hadn't known anything about becoming hip to the hustling routine, getting by fairly easily, meeting all kinds of people, having experiences I never suspected possible, unquote. Later on in the story, he states, quote, we both discovered that we were still interested in junk and that we both preferred it to drinking, unquote. Which, at this point in his life, I mean, he still drinks, but he will have a weird relationship to drinking, saying it's like worse than junk because of his personal experiences, which I think he just gets lucky. Yeah. After prison, Ed would concoct a scheme that is used pretty widely to this day, funny enough. You see, there are corrupt doctors everywhere, and some of those doctors are happy to write scripts to prescription medicine in large enough amounts, and they didn't mind doing business with addicts to sell these prescription drugs to the underbelly of New York City. Specifically, due to World War, the dose, they were able to dose on morphine. Now, this was more established than you would expect, since the doctors were only able to write a prescription, and that still needed to be picked up by a pharmacy nearby. So they would go to the druggist or pharmacist, and that person would have to call the doctor that wrote the prescription in order for them to confirm it. Once they confirmed it was okay, and then they would get the prescription and be on their merry way. The two of them alternated which doctor they would hit and which pharmacist they would hit, depending on the week, and they had a laundry list of all of them. So Ed would hit one corrupt doctor, and at the same time, it seemed like there were plenty of them trying to look to make money. Herbie would hit another on the same day, and they would create a schedule who to hit and when to hit based off their experiences. They would sell some of the morphine they got to the prostitutes on 42nd Street and then use the rest themselves, basically selling enough to keep them afloat. They didn't shitworthy, of course, and many of the doctors they hit were in Brooklyn, outside of Manhattan, but still, they were dope addicts, and let's be real, this wasn't going to last for very long.
Yep.
Maybe they should have noticed that doctors stopped filling out the scripts, regardless of what they said. Maybe it was the fact that he looked and acted like a person addicted to morphine, but this didn't last as long as you would have hoped, or he would have hoped. Quoting the story from Ed Leary, quote, "I presented my script to one of the clerks, one I had spoken with before. He, on this occasion, greeted me pleasurably, inquiring after my general welfare, apologizing due to the rush of business for my having to wait, assuring me I would be taken care of as quickly as possible. There were 2 entranceways to this particular store, and I was taken by complete surprise after having rapidly approached my way of one entrance. At the same time, I realized toward me 2 men who were pushing through the crowd of shoppers. Sets of police reached me simultaneously, grabbing me on both sides, who had gotten to me first and should receive credit for making the arrest. It was both tragic and humorous."
This one's mine.
I mean, at that point, I think you also got like a bonus, right?
Yeah, who knows? But I imagine there's probably a bounty system.
Yeah. This time he did his stint at Rikers. When he looked back at his relationship with Ed Leary, his earliest friend, for lack of a better term, in New York City, he said, "It occurs to me Ed Leary influenced my life in all probability more than anyone else I've known." Obviously, he got out of prison again. When he got out, he would befriend a person that he met named Vicky Russell. Russell came from Detroit, from a widowed father who was gay, and this was only important to mention because the B movement, in my opinion, was on the forefront of accepting gay people in society objectively. And though we won't talk about it specifically in this series, I think it will become abundantly clear why later on. She also became a sex worker in New York City after running away at the age of 18 from her home, and then escaped her pimp and became a pretty hardened criminal afterwards. Huncke would confide in her, and she would be like one of the first in a theme of him finding women to confide without his life. We won't get into all of them. There's a ton, dude. But let's just say that he would sometimes have relations with these women, though I don't know about how physical it was with Vicky, and it was very few and far between.
Well, it sounds like he's just searching for another sister mom.
That's pretty much it. He would write a story about her called Detroit Redhead, 1943 to 1967. More about her later. But before then, the beats. We are going to talk about the sex.
Wait, before that, did he know about the other famous Detroit Red? Malcolm X.
The Wings? Oh, no. Actually, funny enough, that comes up later, so good question. So, sorry, Mom. I know I curse a lot in this podcast, but we're actually going to have to talk about more shit here. You see, Herbert Huncke became one of the foundational people in a sex research study led by the famous researcher Alfred C. Kinsey. You know a little bit about him, Davis. You were talking about him.
Yeah, no, he did the Sex as a Spectrum, so I imagine he probably set one bound at where Herbert Huncke occupies.
Yes. Now, and you would be surprised how much of a bound Herbert Huncke is. I would say that at this point, we're going to diverge from the pod, but we're not actually at all, because Herbert and Alfred are inextricable. So I'm going to get into Kinsey's history and explain how we all benefited from their meeting, realistically. Like many great Americans, Alfred Charles Kinsey was born in New Jersey, specifically in Hoboken. He originally went to Stevens Institute of Technology for Engineering, but transferred to Bowdoin to pursue biology and psychology. He would later complete his doctorate at Harvard and get a job in Indiana University's zoology department. He would become a full-time professor with tenure by the time he was only 35.
Oh, wow.
He used his tenure to start studying at that time, now unfortunately to this day, something that isn't studied very much, the topic of human sexuality. He and his wife, Clara Macmillan Kinsey, would openly talk to students in Indiana about sex and provide guidance about sensitive, and I don't think it's hard to assume at this point, illegal topics at the time.
Yep.
This advice got really popular, and with the okay from the university president, Professor Kinsey launched what was labeled as marriage course that revolved around sex. Around this time, he began interviewing people about their sex lives, for Kinsey and his wife were what we would call as open-minded people, and we find nothing wrong with that today, even if like a lot of people don't find it, but very different. They were very open about their sex and about their sexuality and sexual partners, and had many inside their marriage. Whatever. Now, directly quoting American Hipster, quote, in 1942, he established the Institute of Sex Research on campus and hired a staff to help him interview people. 6 years later, he published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, based on thousands of detailed interviews that he and his associates had conducted all over the country, unquote. He would also follow up his work in 1953 with the book Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. It's not openly stated, but this work had a huge influence. I mean, definitely in the beat movement and the acceptance of homosexuality and sexual behavior that way worldwide. And again, this is Indiana. We're not talking about like what we would consider open sexual, like Indiana is not an open place except for a few pockets.
Yeah, not the woke cultural elite.
There's a reason why the KKK flourished in Indiana more than anywhere else. Let's leave it as that. Now, where are we going to go if you're going to be a sex researcher and trying to compose a book about gay sex? That's right. New York Times seedy underbelly seems pretty fucking logical.
Makes sense.
Sometime around 1942 or 43, I didn't take long for Kinsey to find Herbert Huncke near Times Square. As the story goes, Huncke said that a young woman, a student in the area, said that there was a man who wanted to meet him in his hotel room. He refused to go directly to the hotel room, which was a wise decision no matter what class you live in. Smart on Herbert. Herbie was flat broke at the time, though, and Kinsey was more than willing to buy him a drink and help him out with some food. His skepticism of Kinsey reduced the more he spoke with him, and now quoted Huncke himself. Quote, I must say, I must be thankful by the time to get it out of my system. I had earned my living from sex at one time and have met all kinds of people and hear of and had experiences with some very strange fetishes, end quote. I mean, I believe that.
Yep.
At this point in his life, Herbert Huncke could rely on talking to Alfred Kinsey and get paid to do so. The one thing Herbert refused to do was, because Alfred was this kind of researcher, he asked him to measure his penis, and every single time he refused. Which
is that the first recorded instance of someone refusing to get their measurements?
I mean, I think it was just he thought it was weird that somebody else wanted to do that. And I mean, I get there's a scientific reason for that, but
yeah, but also that information is only useful to the other person.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. It's not useful, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I just know that there was a really funny South Park episode about men being mad about their penis size. That's pretty great.
That's universal.
Yeah, universal. Herbert would be a pivotal figure to the study, not only because of his own experiences, but also because he would introduce Kinsey to many figures who are now considered the key figures of the Beat generation. Of course, there was also monetary value for each new person he would bring to Kinsey, which was $2. Let's not forget that Herbert Huncke always had some sort of ulterior motive throughout the series, even if it was,
Yeah, it's a classic pusher, man.
Yeah. Or like, just like a personal, I want this person to be better, but like there's always an ulterior motive. Let's be real here. He was a massive drug addict. Also, World War the sequel is on. What are you going to do to kick both a drug habit and afford the draft, Davis?
Amphetamines?
I mean, you might actually get tested for that, right? I don't know.
No, it's...
Well, were there blood tests back then?
Public gay sex, probably.
Again, did they care back then?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess that would have been the best way of doing it. Well, he took to the seas.
Just take to the seas.
Our boy Herbert Huncke decides to become a sailor, specifically with the Merchant Marines.
It's a ballsy choice.
He did this with one of his good friends, Phil White. Being that this was their first big voyage, they wanted to kick heroin. They partied fucking hard beforehand. They found the boat sailing out of New Jersey in a blinding snowstorm, and Phil White, also known as Whitey, was so messed up he spent like 2 days in his cot to the dismay of the captain.
Getting off heroin on a boat, it's got to be pretty fucking brutal.
I mean, yeah, especially those 40s like war boats that probably rocked hard. They eventually wooed the captain by the time they were in the Caribbean, though, which is fucking far from Jersey.
Like actually wooed, or?
Well, I mean, the captain had no other choice.
Yeah.
What are they going to do, kick him off the boat? They're also Merchant Marines. Of course, this sobriety scheme didn't work even a fucking little bit. Huncke found somebody who was stealing the morphine syrups from the lifeboats. And there was so much pot on the boat, it was silly. Also, They were in the fucking Caribbean, near South America, which meant cocaine. And since there was a massive war happening, there was also a ton of drugs being transported all the time, because coke, as much as like Herbert like did it, he didn't really like it. He liked his other shit, things like Benzedrine, Nembutal, Seconal, Ambutal, and of course the ton of morphine and pot that was mentioned before, which he even like bragged about spending D-Day on drugs, scoring drugs.
Nice.
I guess that's a better place than fucking Normandy Beach.
Well, I mean, there's an easy way to score drugs on Normandy Beach, but I don't think anybody wants it.
Yeah, and that's by participating in a My Chemical Romance video. Along with his sea voyage, which is the title of the story where I got a lot of this info from, they didn't just pick up drugs. During their stop in Cologne, Panama, Huncke stumbles upon a boy who is tormenting a monkey with a stick. Huncke, for all his faults, was compassionate and buys the monkey from the boy. Quote, Jocko, the monkey, took to pot like the proverbial duck to water. And as soon as I would light up, he would jump on my shoulder and I would exhale the smoke into his little grinning face.
Nice.
He and I would get high and would balance himself on the rail while I leaned up against and looked at the sea, unquote.
It's quite a visage.
Of course, the sea voyage ends. He left Jocko on the ship with the crew, with somebody who promised to make sure that he would get back to Aruba or Cologne. But the sea voyage, to kick his habit, was an abject 100% failure.
How many crossings did he end up making?
Across the sea, not many. He was basically just in the Caribbean. The Merchant Marine, obviously, is just a protection of merchant vehicles, right?
The Merchant Marine is just the people working on the ships.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, there wasn't much in the way of protection. You were just, doing civilian shit, just carrying tanks.
Yeah. Still, you can go to the Merchant Marine Academy in this country.
Yeah.
Back in New York City in 1944, basically one of the first things that happens to Herbie will change literary history. One of Herbie's friends knocked on the door. In the doorway with his friend was none other than William Burroughs. Billy Burroughs would be one of the most important figures of all the beat movement, if you're not aware. And I won't relay his backstory too much because we will need to cover him one day, only to say that this relationship and the relationship of other writers that will be touched upon shortly will be what becomes the beat movement. William Burroughs, at this point, was also a drug addict who was given an allowance of $150 a month, $2,750 today by his parents, which he used to score drugs and get himself into trouble. His father was a business scion out of St. Louis, Missouri at the time, back when Missouri was descending, but still, St. Louis was
still
huge.
Still the gateway to the West.
Yep. Billy B wanted to sell Herbert Huncke and Phil Whitey some morphine. Huncke immediately was turned off by him due to his clean-cut appearance. His first reaction was, Jesus Christ, get him out of here, man. This guy's the heat. He wasn't, but I could believe that. He had to be talked out of his suspicions, but there would be events that would both inextricably tie these two together, though I don't think either really liked one another all that much ever, just based off of everything that I've read. As exemplified from this quote from Huncke, quote, I had observed Bill only a moment or two, but decided I didn't feel friendly toward him, sizing him up in my mind as dull appearing and a bit smug and self-opinionated and certainly not very hip, unquote. I have to say he probably was hip just based off where he ends up, but he was definitely smug and self-opinionated, and I'm not a big fan of William Burroughs reading about him through this book.
Also, I can't imagine that he was hip only by virtue of changing what hip was. Like, coming from that background, there's no way that he could have been considered hip in the contemporary.
Still, Burroughs and Whitey would do a ton of drugs together, as well as Huncke, including benzos and opiates, staying up for 2 to 3 days at a time. I'm adding this here, but like basically at one point, and this is later on, but Burroughs would ask Huncke to do a drug first because he used him basically as a guinea pig, like constantly.
What an asshole!
Yeah, he's such an asshole. And like one of the drugs he gave, like Huncke like knew what he was doing and he didn't trust a drug, and it did not have a good effect on Huncke. Huncke like lied to him because he was such a good drug user at that point. He could tolerate it, so he shot up the drug. I don't know what it was. It was just like a bad thing. And immediately he turned to him and he said,
Psych.
You fucking asshole, and started having a bad time. So at least he got back there. It was through Burroughs that Huncke would meet another key figure of the beat movement. Now, quote in Huncke's Guilty of Everything, quote, the first time I met Kerouac was on a day not long after I had met Bill. I was hanging out in Washington Square Park when Bill and Jack walked by. Bill introduced me and then told me he'd picked up something in the way of a narcotic and asked me if I knew anything about it, unquote. He then later continues, quote, Kerouac was a typical clean-cut American type. He looked to me like the arrow collar man. They always had these clean-cut young progressive American businessmen in their ads with their hair cut neatly and a twinkle in the eye. That was Jack Kerouac, unquote.
Oh, not what I always pictured him.
Yeah, Jack Kerouac, I mean, yeah, he was like a hometown Lynn boy, right? So, if I'm not mistaken, Lynn.
I don't actually know.
He's from Massachusetts. I think it was Lynn, the city of sin. You don't come out the way you come in. Through Bill, he also met Joan Vollmer, who would eventually be known as Joan Burroughs. William's wife. Joan and Herbie would become very, very good friends, confiding in one another. If it wasn't clear at this series, then I will state it now. Huncke had a revolving door at young female confidants, something that would be certainly coming from mommy issues.
So is the sister mom becoming the sister daughter?
It ends up being like a boy thing later. Spoiler alert. William, Jack, and Bill were living in Joan's 115th Street apartment and would throw parties together. It was in this apartment that Huncke would also meet their other roommate, Allen Ginsberg. Though early on they wouldn't be very close friends, it would be Ginsberg's relationship with Huncke that would truly define the beat movement, and they would be lifelong, well, friends is hard to say at times, but they would be attached in a way that is inextricable, again, using that word. This series is about Herbert Huncke, and I don't want to get into deep ties of all these figures. Truthfully, it's important to know a few things about them, though. Firstly, many of these writers were gay, or at least bi. This is important only because of what the Beats wrote about and why it was immensely popular. Sexuality was not written much about at that point, at least not this openly, and definitely not gay sexuality. And though there are some genuinely perverse ways they wrote about sex and some that honestly were sex criminals, or at least what they were saying was crimes. Burroughs, for instance, in Naked Lunch is basically just pure smut and having sex with little boys. Some of the greatest works in the movement revolves around gay affairs. As already stated, Huncke would introduce Ginsberg and Burroughs to Alfred Kinsey as well, who would interview him for his study. Them for their study. And they all took massive amounts of drugs together, which I don't know if that was clear already. With the exception of Kerouac, who mostly drank a ton. He didn't really like the drugs.
Wait, so this does beg the question. Did Kinsey interview any normies?
Yeah, but like those aren't the ones that he would write about.
Yeah, unremarkable.
Yeah. Well, he was also trying to open up the
yeah,
sexual
no, it's
experience.
expand the range.
Yeah. It was also a very misogynistic culture, the Beats, according to Herbie's biographer, Hilary Holiday, which I kind of agree with. An example she gives is that during a bender, Ginsberg would claim that he heard the voice of William Blake reciting poems in his apartment while he lay in bed and masturbated. Meanwhile, Joan Burroughs was sent to Bellevue Hospital, which is a hospital for the mentally ill in New Jersey, because she wandered the streets strung out on amphetamines, the same thing that gave him the voices, which were provided to her by none other than her husband, of course. Joan, of all people, was probably the most tragic person of this scene.
Was Bellevue where Nellie Bly did her expose on the...
That's a good question. I don't know. I think Bellevue is where Woody Guthrie lived. Well, he died. I think that's where it is. Please let me know if that's the case.
Yeah, don't mind me.
This group of future literary giants would hang out for a few years in New York together, scoring drugs from disreputable pharmacists. Again, didn't last long, and the crew had to disband. Huncke's journey found him back in prison in the Bronx, this time on drug charges. When Huncke got out a few months later, much of the gang had split. He hadn't anything, basically, to live on. He had signed up to board a ship at that point, set to sail for Singapore, which was noted as a place where you could find really good dope, apparently. However, he also was invited to stay at William Burroughs' farm for the summer in Texas, where he would plant and grow marijuana and poppy seeds and harvest them for personal use as well as product, the latter being far less productive than you can imagine. Mm-hmm. This was actually a ploy of Burroughs' family, not the drugs, but to get him out of New York, because New York City was causing him trouble, at least that's what they were believing. This was truly a dilemma for our dope fiend friend here. Now quoting Huncke again, "Let it suffice that curiosity and love for Joan tipped the scale in favor of joining Burroughs and helping him with his plans for experimenting with the soilless growth of marijuana and oriental poppies," unquote.
Ooh. No update. Bellevue, it's in Manhattan.
Is it Manhattan?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Belvedere. Excuse me. That's right.
Yeah, but it does get a shout out in Howell.
Yes, it's a big one, and there's a reason for that. We'll talk about it actually very shortly.
Oh.
The farm itself was 12 miles outside of New Waverly, Texas, which is a town about 60 miles of Houston, which is fucking hot as hell. It's a lot less isolated today due to the population boom that's currently happening in Texas, but in the late 40s, it was pretty much the middle of nowhere. This is what Huncke wrote about it. Quote, "It was situated on the edge of a piece of property consisted of 976 acres in the midst of pine woods, which began at the top of a gentle incline with the cabin in an enclosed yard or fenced-in area at the top of several sheds and an old collapsing barn, and then rolled downward into a bayou, twisting and turning its way through the country, a place of tropical vines and Spanish moss-draped trees where sunlight filtered through the heavy, lush, green-grown vegetation, and one could get lost or have strange adventures, and that it had always been there since the beginning of time and hardly been felt the intrusion of man. It was wild and beautiful and mysterious, and always imagined I was entering a great steaming jungle each time I would go down to explore its shadowed depths," unquote. Sounds like a beautiful place.
It does sound like he's describing the bayou in the best possible light, but I do think it's interesting that he managed to find sanctuary in a swamp. But
I I don't think, I mean, who knows? At this point, he hasn't seen nature in a while, too, so, like, true nature. Of course, knowing his crew, the pot and poppy farm was never going to be successful. They did the minimum amount of work needed to make the farm, well, frankly, everything they wanted it to be. And everything I've read about William Burroughs makes me really not like the dude. Mostly the three of them would get high with the dope that they grew on the farm and with Huncke making runs to corrupt pharmacists in the neighborhood again. Presumably making long trips at times in order to score things like benzos and then go out and buy booze, and they would get high all day. According to Huncke, a lot of what they did was shoot a large variety of guns that William Burroughs owned, which I will now have to add, as this is, if anybody who's slightly familiar with William Burroughs knows that what happened to his wife, right? You familiar with the story, Davis?
Not the intricacies, but didn't she end up either she ended up offing herself or he ended up doing it? But that's my understanding, at least.
Well, he ended up doing it. It's not very. It's something that Hillary Holiday really touches upon a bunch, because I think she enjoyed Jones Burroughs and hated William Burroughs as much as I did based off of it. But yeah, they went to Mexico. They were drunk doing like heroin, and he decided to try to shoot a shot off her head and shot her instead.
Oh,
yep.
More tropes.
Terrible. I mean, she was murdered by her husband, and he basically got away with it. Huncke and many other people believe it was a strange accident, but I will let the listeners come up with their own circumstances and make their own assumptions, but I made mine, clearly. Burroughs also pulled some really horrible stunts, like how he went on rants about race wars that were inevitable, omitting the racial slurs here for this podcast, and how one day he pulled this stunt while on a walk with his wife, Joan, and Herbie, and quoting Hillary Holiday. Quote, Bill got impatient and said Joan should take a tip from the Spartan women of old, that is, at the bidding of the warrior husbands or tribe elders, leave unfit babies to die. Burroughs didn't seem to be joking, and when he spotted an old well on one of their walks, he announced it was an ideal place for dropping their child. Unquote.
Woof.
Rough. I wrote there it might have been the child of Jones's first husband and her, but horrible.
But I also can't imagine what they were putting in their bodies was doing that child growing any favors either.
No. Of course, there must have been some great experiences on this farm, because Huncke did really enjoy his time there. And from everything I read, it was also on this farm that he almost certainly met the quintessential figure of the beat movement, and then later would transition into the 60s county culture, which was none other than Neal Cassady himself. I won't get too much into their relationship because it really doesn't exist that much, but just know that Allen Ginsberg, who was visiting the farm at the time, was really, really trying to do his best to sleep with Neal Cassady. And that there would be a lot of sexual attention between Ginsberg and who he sleeps with, and who Huncke also finds sexually attractive throughout the rest of their lives. Not to say that either of them did actually sleep with Cassady, because there is a strange and confusing web of sexual relationships going on at this point, let's be honest. But that summer, like all, ended.
So is the entire movement punctuated by sexual frustration and other issues, or is it really just Huncke who got the ball rolling?
Oh no,
on that?
If you've read anything by Ginsberg or Burroughs, it is, and Kerouac less so, but the spoiler alert, but the ending of On the Road is about them partying at a brothel in Mexico. So no, it's all of them. That summer, like all, ended, and Huncke, Burroughs, and Cassady drove back in Bill's Jeep that sounded like it was loaded with pot. And Neal Cassady drove, and in his style, basically got it done straight away.
Because the one competent person in the group.
Neal Cassady, if you know anything else about him, he was an excellent driver, but also reckless, but excellent at the same time. This was September of 1947. New York City, September 1947, Huncke got back to his old ways, and he got back to jail. Reasons unknown to me at this point, then he got out of jail. Out of jail, Huncke would basically mooch off people and live in places until he got kicked out of them. This is a habit he had for the rest of his life. His rampant drug use, though, frankly, was really what was causing this. Huncke was also known for coming into whatever place he was allowed to stay in and completely redecorating the room and the rooms to his style, while according to the witnesses that lived there was often quite nice, though it's hard to actually fathom it because his own lifestyle, also based off what was going on, was not very good. He would also got into his friends' homes, and they would steal their shit to pawn it.
Nice.
Notably, he did this several times to Allen Ginsberg, one time stealing Ginsberg's roommate's expensive and apparently massive book collection, which he needed for his college studies, and then pawning it, and then Allen's well-off parents having to reimburse his roommate for basically everything. The books at that point were worth about $200, which is about $2,700 now. And if you don't think that's absurd, or you think it is, you really have never taken an economics course in college. Yeah. It is not an absurd cost.
No, and that sounds about 2 semesters worth of textbooks now.
Yeah,
for a college course.
If there was any field who robbed their students more blindly for economics was it, realistically. But that's just a personal grudge. Being robbed by Herbert Huncke was basically an occupational hazard. There was some restitution, but Allen did get kicked out of his apartment. Now, this would have ended my relationship with somebody, honestly, if they did this and pulled the shit on me, but bluntly.
Yeah, but you're a bibliophile.
But also, like, you fucking stole my shit and pawned it.
Yeah.
Like, fuck that shit. Ginsberg is a different person, and like I previously mentioned, and I also think it's a different time. Like, this was kind of, I guess, more accepted. I don't know. They would be friends for a long, long time. Huncke, again, went to jail, and again, who knows which reason. It wasn't for the robberies. While he was in jail, Ginsberg sent him a letter saying that he was welcome to stay at his place any time again, but again, who the hell knows why. There was some kind of perverse sympathy because his other, let's say, friends had basically rejected him outright for stealing Ginsberg's roommate's shit from under him. Like, Burroughs specifically started to just reject him. Huncke would never get this letter, however, though a few months later, and this is important, in the winter of 1949, when Huncke was released, he was in awful shape, so much so that he was bleeding out of his feet. He ended up at Ginsberg's apartment. Ginsberg invited him to let him live with him, which is like, again, wow. And you want to know what Herbie did? He slept in Ginsberg's bed and rested enough to get out of his prison stupor. The first thing he did afterwards was steal a car.
His Ginsberg's car?
No, just a random car. Now, I'm going to show my hand here because if you are even slightly, even insignificantly familiar with the Beats, you know that Allen Ginsberg wrote a chapbook and a poem called Howl. In this poem, he writes of the unnamed Beat characters that, quote, who walked all night with their shoes full of blood on the snowbank docks, waiting for a door in the East River to open to a room full of steam, heat, and opium, unquote.
Is that his first appearance in the literary record, or Huncke's first appearance in the literary record? Because there's remarkably little about his work.
So far, yeah, but this is at least the first influential one that would occur. However, it's not the first one that would publish. Yes, it's universally believed that Herbert Huncke was the person he was talking to. Now, I have to show my hand again because this is no means the only work he personally influences. However, we will need to talk about another major life event for Ginsberg and Huncke that would change their lives forever. Remember Vicky Russell, Detroit redhead?
Yep.
Well, she had become a pretty hardcore thief, drug user, and all-in-all hustler. She was also 6 feet tall, which made her basically the most tallest and imposing figure around.
Yeah, in the group.
Yeah, with the exception of a few people. Well, her and her boyfriend, Jack Melody, a.k.a. Little Jack because he was a small dude, Jack, who is also rumored to be related to the Italian mob, was probably a mafioso. Well, they also started hanging out with Herbert Huncke from their old connection. And then they started stealing shit together. And then they all started living in Allen Ginsberg's apartment together. And all that stolen shit wound up in Ginsberg's apartment. Herbert Huncke, let's be real, was also stealing shit with them.
It's like the ending of Casablanca, except we'll always have Ginsberg's place.
Allen Ginsberg, for his part, knew that this wasn't good, but he was partially too afraid to kick these legit criminals out, and he also wanted to play criminal for what I can only describe as academic reasons.
Fair enough.
Of course, this doesn't pan out for any of them. April 22nd, 1949, to be specific, Earth Day, in which they were driving a stolen car full of stolen clothes and Ginsberg's manuscripts that were filled with material that was definitely illegal at the time. Because if you know anything about Ginsberg's poems, they're very sexually explicit. This shouldn't, again, surprise anybody, especially if you read anything by him, and any Beat Generation author. They went on for a drive together with all this stolen shit. Jack had lost his way, getting distracted somewhere in Queens, and a police officer flagged them down to tell them they were going the wrong way on a one-way street. Just complete incompetency.
Out of your fucking gourd.
Absolutely, probably a high. Maybe they could have been okay, but then Jack hit the gas pedal and the cops fucking chased them down. Now quoting American Hipster, quote, as startled bystanders looked on, the speeding car took a sharp turn and flipped over twice.
Jesus.
Yeah, that was back in the day. Cars were made completely different. Yeah, 1949. That was still like,
no safety.
Driver and passengers staggered out, unquote. Ginsberg had lost most of his manuscripts with the exception of one tiny notebook, and he also lost his glasses, virtually blinding him. Meanwhile, Herbert Huncke was at a party celebrating the publication of Jack Kerouac's The Town and the City. When he got home, it was a complete mess.
I bet.
It didn't take long for the cops to find them. Among other things, they had admitted to stealing at least $10,000 worth of jewelry at the time, fencing some of it beforehand, but they were really in some serious shit now. Long story short, Allen Ginsberg somehow scooted by, though honestly, he did little in what would happen and was barely an accomplice to these robberies. His father was able to get him into a mental asylum, which was Bellevue, where his mother also lived, was sent to at one point, which also would make literary history. Like I said, it ran in the family, as I quote here. That's another time for when I talk about Ginsberg. Vicki Russell, Detroit redhead herself, turned out to be somebody completely different. Her real name was Priscilla Arminger, someone from a respectable family from Grosse Pointe, Michigan, which, if you know anything about Michigan, Grosse Pointe is one of the most affluent places outside of Detroit. So, yeah, not the person anybody thought she was. Vicky ends up being a suburban housewife after her family gets her out of this mess. Out of all things, she ends up having a family and going to HOA meetings and being on the school board. Fucking, that makes a lot of sense for school boards now, right?
Yeah, it makes a lot of, and HOAs for that matter.
The HOA might not be true, but the school board is.
They're a pretty new development, but.
Little Jack isn't as lucky, getting a hefty sentence as the media touted him as the brains of the whole operation. And as for Huncke, well, that's a story of itself. He didn't have anything to do with the crimes, but the stolen goods were in the apartment where he was living. And he had a warrant out for his arrest for stolen goods and other robberies. And literally everybody in the neighborhood knew him due to all the constant getting in and getting out of trouble and the complete rampant heroin use. Herbie got 5 years, which he would serve in Sing Sing. This would be the most fruitful time for all the beats, by the way, and we'll get back to that.
So he was holding back all his contemporaries just by existing.
Partially, kind of, yeah. But before we do that, I want to tie up loose ends. So remember Phil White, the Whitey,
Mm-hmm.
Whitey Philly, which is a terrible way of putting it, but like this is going to be crude, and you will get in a second why. Phil White was the person Huncke went to the sea voyage, right? I have to preface this by saying this is going to be a very, very violent man, a murderer himself, fueled by Tuinol and heroin. He died in the most absurd way I could think of. While in prison, that was running concurrently the same time as Huncke, though different reasons why. He died in 1952. At the same time as Huncke was about to leave prison. His death was categorized as a prison suicide, but what happened allegedly was he was attempting suicide by creating a noose from his bed sheets to make it look like he was trying to kill himself. The guard who responded to him hit the switch that opened the cell door, which then swung open and pulled the rope and tightened it, suffocating him to death. Just awful.
Irony.
I mean, I'm laughing. It's a horrible way to go. But again, he was a mass murderer. Not a mass murderer. He was just a murderer. I'm adding this for clear drama, and I'm sorry for people who are offended by laughing at this shit. It's dark, but beats are just full of this shit, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was 50-50. It was either going to go that way or it was going to be a David Carradine type event.
So next episode, we will start the stories that he inspired, how his writing career got kicked off. We will also get into his later life, but know that he'll be coming in and out of prison for so much of his early life that it's really hard and real theme here. He's probably the most emblematic of beat writers in that sense, even though he did come from wealth. He had none to fall back to, which was not true for the other beat writers. And they all had wealth to go back to.
They all had loving families.
Yeah, or at least accepting and willing to support him. His drug habit also was so far gone at one point. This guy, in my opinion, really did exemplify the beat generation, and we'll talk about that more in the next episode.
Looking forward to it.
Any thoughts?
Again, it's absolutely insane, but makes so much sense.
Absolutely. Once I learned about this guy, I was like, now I get why people fucking love them and why they're nuts. Again, I have a Patreon. It's not a scam, according to them. Jesus Christ, the guy flag. Lostinthelibrary.com. At patreon.com. Any questions, lostinthelibrarypodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram, again, Lost in the Library Podcast. I have a Substack at Fil Deptula, my name, which everything's up there for free until maybe one day it's not. I don't know. Who knows? And again, in real time, my life is about to change very drastically. But see you for next episode during this marathon spree.
I'll catch you next time.